And there'll be a huge opportunity at the end for us to continue to have Q&A as well. So there'll be plenty of time for this. Okay, so I've just flown through some basic definitions just so that we can know what we're talking about. And I've said that the core to whether you should raise investment is, do you actually have an underlying commercial model that sells goods and services for a profit in order to be able to create social impact? So let me now talk a little bit about what exactly we mean by a business model, what we mean by a social business model. And in the work that I've done at Ashoka over the last 12 years, I think it's very helpful to basically define 3 types of social business models that social entrepreneurs create. And it's very helpful for you to know which one of those 3 do you belong to? And because each one of these 3 has different characteristics. Okay, so here's how to think about the different types of business models that exist, that are out there. If you think about any kind of social enterprise, you can see it as really the combination of 2 different models, which we're going to call the impact model and the business model. So what do I mean by that? An impact model essentially is what the organization does in order to create social impact for its beneficiaries. Okay, so every charity has an impact model. In other words, every charity has some kind of activity which it does, which creates social impact for some kind of group that it wants to serve, right? Maybe it's delivering training to women entrepreneurs. Maybe it's delivering solar lighting to rural villages, whatever it might be. So that's the impact model. And then social businesses have a business model which is aligned with that. And a business model essentially is, how do you make money? How do you make profit? How do you, what kind of goods and services do you sell to customers in order to generate the income to fund your work? And so we call that the business model. And what I've done here is I've drawn 2 concentric circles which describe the relationship between these 2 models. So, you might have 2, and essentially the 3 different models that I'm going to describe to you essentially come out of the relationship between these 2 circles. So let me just give you an example of that. There are 3 kinds of generic model that I think we can talk about. I'm going to call them the integrated model, the hybrid model, and the sponsorship model. Okay, so the integrated model, the hybrid model, and the sponsorship model. And each one of these models essentially is asking the question, what is the relationship between your impact model and your business model? So let's start with the integrated model. So in the integrated model of social business, essentially your impact model is your business model. Okay, so in other words, you create social impact by selling a specific product or service. And the more you sell, the more successful you are, the more impact you create. And so they're one and the same thing. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. So basically here, there's just one entity and one organization that we're talking about, which is the social business. My example here is going to be a company called Solarise, which sells solar power kits. And so what happens is that here is this solar energy company operating in rural Africa to households that don't have access to electricity. And what they do is they go into these households and they electrify them using their solar panels. And what you can see here is that the households can then benefit by not having to use kerosene candles anymore. So they can now use high quality solar lights. And that is the social impact of this organization. So here, it's actually very simple, right? The more successful the business, the more goods that they sell, the more the beneficiaries, who are the customers, benefit from that. And so the organization doesn't have to worry about the difference between the 2. The mission is the business. It's one and the same thing. The more they sell, the better they will be. The only question might be, do they want to make as much profit as possible, or do they want to sell as many as possible by pricing as low as possible? So there might be a trade-off between profitability and growth, or profitability and distribution, right? But there's no conflict between the impact model and the business model. One and the same thing. Okay. The other type of model is what we might call a sponsorship model. And in this case, what happens is that the social entrepreneur actually has 2 different entities doing two different things. So there is an impact model, which is typically done by a charity, and that charity is simply doing whatever it's doing for its beneficiaries. And alongside that, the entrepreneur has decided to create a separate business which generates profits and then uses those profits to support the work of the charity. So in other words, the business essentially is a revenue generator for the social mission. However, it might not necessarily be aligned with the social mission or indeed related to the work of the charity. In fact, it might be completely different. Okay, so um, uh, in this model, this would essentially be a business that supports a charity or a business that supports a foundation. And we don't normally recommend Ashoka Fellows or social entrepreneurs to adopt this model because essentially it requires running two different organizations that are doing two different things, right? Running a business and then running a charity. And if your core skill set is the impact, is the charity, then setting up a business just to generate profits, just so you can fund the work of your charity, can be very time consuming and very distracting. And normally what happens is this only works where the entrepreneur is able to create two separate teams and two separate brands in order to be able to subsidize the work of the charity. Moreover, I mean, you have to basically build a very different skill set in order to do this, right? So the skill set required to run a business is often quite different from that required to run an NGO or a charity. Nevertheless, there are certain Ashoka Fellows who've done this brilliantly. And what they've usually been able to do is to find a way to make the business very, very brand aligned and mission aligned with the work of the charity in a way that actually builds the message of the charity and supports it, or at least supports the mission in some way. So I'm going to give you two examples of Ashoka Fellows that have done this. So here's a diagram just showing the relationship between those two. You've got the charity, you've got the business, they're quite separate. The business generates profits and it gives the profits to the charity. Okay, so that's the funding model that we're talking about here. Let me talk to you about two examples of fellows that I think have done this well. And I think they are the rare exceptions, to be quite honest, but we can talk about the benefits of this and the pros and cons in just a moment. So Tristram Stewart is an Ashoka Fellow in the UK. Many years ago, he launched a charity called Feedback. And what Feedback does is it fights the problem of food waste. So from supermarkets, from restaurants, from many different outlets, but essentially almost 1/3 to 40% of all food that is bought is thrown away. So there is a huge amount of food that is wasted in the world. And Feedback is a charity. It raises donations and it runs extraordinary campaigns to convince consumers not to waste food. They also work with supermarkets and they persuade them to manage the issue around food waste and food packaging. A couple of years ago, Tristram and his team were exploring creative ways that they could maybe explain to the public how not to waste food. And one of the eye-catching ideas they had was to launch a business called Toast Ale. And what Toast Ale does is it takes bread that would otherwise be thrown away by bakeries and it brews it into beer called Toast Ale, which is sold very successfully in pubs and supermarkets all across the UK. Ashoka supported Tristram in launching Toast Ale as a separate business. We had Ashoka supporters who invested in Toast Ale to get it going. And all of the profits from Toast Ale as a business go towards Feedback, the charity, in order to support its work. And so it's a great revenue generator for Feedback. So that to me is an almost perfect example of a sponsorship model, right? Tristram created two separate teams in order to do this because he didn't want to dilute the team at Feedback or distract them from their core work. At the same time, he hired in a commercial team whose sole job it was to build the business. A very good team of social entrepreneurs led by my good friend Rob Wilson, who's a former Ashoka staff member, and who has the commercial skills in order to make that a success. And the nature of what Toast does is completely supportive of the mission. So when you buy a Toast Ale beer can, you learn about food waste, you understand that your profits go towards supporting this charity, it builds the brand, it markets the message. So that's a really good example of how to do a sponsorship model well. But it requires great business skill in order to be able to create that separate business subsidiary in order to make it successful. Another a great example of a sponsorship model is the work of our Belgian fellow Arnold Raskin, who runs a fantastic charity called Mobile School. And as many of you know, Mobile School provides education for street children. They operate in, I believe, 18 countries around the world. And it's purely a charity. There's no revenue model here. They have a mobile van which they take into favelas and slums and other areas where there are street children, and they run education. But what Arnaud has done brilliantly is that he has created a separate business called Streetwise, which is an executive leadership consultancy. And Streetwise has developed a training curriculum on entrepreneurship based on the lessons that Arnaud and his team developed from working with street children. Because if you can survive in the streets, by definition, you are a fantastic entrepreneur. You have developed incredible skills. And those skills can be cataloged, those skills can be taught. And so they teach them as leadership training to executives, to leading brands, to leading companies. Many of whom then, because they learn about the work of Mobile School, will go on to sponsor the Mobile School and provide additional support for them. So here's an example of a brand which is a separate business, which is a really, really good advert for the charity, at the same time generating profit and funds that go and support its work. So that's probably the best example in the world that I know of a great sponsorship model, where you have a business that's very, very aligned and indeed couldn't work without the credibility that Arnaud has from his work with the Mobile School. So if you're a fellow who is exploring developing a business model, I would strongly encourage thinking about how you could leverage your existing social work in some creative way in order to be able to generate that revenue model. Don't try and do something which is completely unrelated to what you're doing or doesn't build on what you're doing. The essence here is to create a business that really supports the charity closely and generates demand, customers, supporters, branding, marketing for your core organization. So that's the sponsorship model. And then the final model, which is something where those two circles, the impact model and the business model, overlap but are not exactly the same. And this we call the hybrid model. And what happens here is that essentially you have a business and a non-profit that work side by side to deliver a social mission together. So think about a health company, for example, operating in water and sanitation in East Africa. And imagine that one of the things that it does is it provides public health campaigns to educate people on how to manage water cleanly, how to boil water, how to purify water, how not to get sick. That would be a pure charity. It doesn't have any revenue model and it doesn't want a revenue model. They basically give those services for free because they want to reach as many people as possible. But they might, for example, have a secondary business which sells medicine or water cleaning tablets to people at low cost. And that could be a business which works alongside the charity in order to fulfill a single social mission, which is to help people overcome the problems of clean water, dirty water in East Africa, for example. So an example of that in Europe would be an organization like Fair Finance, which is run by UK Ashoka Fellow Faisal Rahman. And what Fair Finance does is it works with customers in the UK who are financially excluded. These are individuals who would not be able to get access to a mainstream bank account or be able to borrow from a mainstream bank. And what Fair Finance does is it has two organizations. One which is a charity which provides debt advice to people who are over indebted, and that's done for free. And it has a business which provides microloans to help people reschedule their debts and move back into mainstream finance. And that is a lending business which provides affordable loans. And so this is not a separate business. These two work together, even though they are separate legal entities. but under one brand, which is called Fair Finance. So you have Fair Debt Advice, which gives the advice, and you have Fair Money, which gives the loans. And as far as the customers are concerned, they just see one organization, Fair Finance. So that, again, is a route which a fellow might adopt, where you have a range of charitable activities that don't generate income, and you have a range of business activities that do, and they're not separate, but you want to put them together in a way that you can raise donations for the social business, for the social mission, and investment for the actual business itself, which is what Faisal was able to do 9 years ago very successfully. He was in fact the first client on our social finance program, and I believe he's raised well over $5 million now in finance by structuring his organization in a way that it can raise both grants and donations using this hybrid business model. And what you're seeing here is the structuring diagram for how that might look. So two legal entities held together by a parent company, which is the head of the group. So those are three different types of social business model. And if you're thinking about setting up a social business or raising investment, you would want to think about which one of those is most appropriate for you. Do you want to be a single integrated model where you essentially are a business, in which case investment is very suitable for what you're doing? Are you a sponsorship type model where you have two separate businesses, and a business and a charity, and the business generates profits to support the charity? In which case you will have to decide how much of your time and energy would you spend on the business versus the charity. Do you need to hire a new team to run the business? And what is the balance of activity between those two for your organization and for you personally? And finally, the hybrid model. Do you actually have an organization which does many different things, some of which are businesses and some of which are charitable? In which case, maybe what you want to do is actually create a structure where you have subsidiaries, some of which are businesses that raise investment, and some of which are charities that just simply raise donations. And if you set up that structure, you can then cleanly invite donors into the charity and investors into the business without mixing the two up, which creates tremendous confusion otherwise. Because often it's very difficult to raise both donations and investment otherwise in the same organization, because there's often a conflict between donors and investors. So those are three different template models that you may want to explore when thinking about whether and how to raise social investment. And if you were to join our future webinars or look at the Social Investment Toolkit, you will see a lot more material about these different opportunities with more case studies, and we can walk you through in much more detail which of those options you may wish to explore. So let me just quickly pause there. Are there any questions about those three models? And then I will move on to talking about different types of finance.
I've got a question.
Sure.
I just wondering, more of our people that were, the fellows and other social entrepreneurs we're talking to are setting up foundations that own commercial businesses.
Yeah.
Is that I mean, when that last diagram you had a parent company, but you said they were two separate legal entities. If you have a foundation, but as the umbrella and a commercial thing under that, does that come into being a sort of non-profit?
Yeah, so if you have a foundation, which is the parent, then you actually can do both the sponsorship model or the hybrid model. So what would normally happen in that situation is that the fellow would allocate certain business activities to its business subsidiary, and it would retain charitable activity, which is non-income generating in the foundation. And so by splitting out those two activities, you can present the business very cleanly to investors, and you can present the charity very cleanly to the foundation very cleanly to donors. And then you can avoid this kind of bust up between, is one person giving in free money while the other person is getting a return, which is often a difficult and contentious issue. The other reason why a fellow might want to have a foundation which owns a for-profit business is to show that the whole group is mission locked. In other words, it has a very clear social mission, and it's the foundation which actually calls the shots, because the foundation is the owner of the for-profit and also directs fundamentally the core activity of the for-profit. So even though the for-profit is a business, even though it has shareholders, fundamentally, the for-profit will be directed by the foundation to make sure that it stays in alignment with its social cause. And that's a very powerful way to demonstrate that the whole group is still clearly social, which is very, very important for many of our fellows. They don't want any risk that the business could be perceived as profiteering, nor do they want any risk that the business could be seen as taking the mission away from the original organization, which might happen, for example, if the business raises investment and the investors have a different set of values from the original founders. So one way to control that is to give the foundation special rights that enable them to be very clear about what the business will and will not do. Okay, and we can talk about legal structures. Again, typically what happens in these types of structures is the social entrepreneur will typically end up incorporating both a for-profit subsidiary as well as a non-profit entity in what they do. There are a couple of jurisdictions where there are entities that can be both a charity and a for-profit, such as the UK, and to a limited extent, the United States. However, for the majority of countries in Europe, that is not the case. You have to pick and choose whether you're going to be a charity or a business. And if you have to pick and choose, what most of the social business people end up doing is doing both. They'll say, I'll have a charity and I will have a business, and I will do, investment into the business and do commercial work, and I will do donations and into the charity, and I will do non-commercial work, and that's how they square that circle, because there isn't one entity which is adequate for both. So again, if that's a route that you want to explore, we have lawyers who can support you in that journey, and we've done that structuring many times now, so we can walk you through that and help you through that process. But there's a whole bunch of legal engineering that has to be done in order to give the social business the optimal legal structure to be able to do what you want to do.